Hi everyone, I am Nikhil Mittal. This video accompanies my blog post on DCShadow. Those of you who have not heard of it or are unaware of it, DCShadow is an attack technique presented by Vincent and Benjamin at Blue Hat Israel this year in January 2018. DCShadow allows anyone with enough privileges or permissions, any user in a domain, so by default, or the most convenient way is if you have DA permissions, we can actually modify any attribute of a user or a computer or any other object in a domain, which opens up, and of course without leaving logs, so which opens up a lot of opportunities related to uh, persistence techniques in an Active Directory environment. So the blog post in the blog post which I have written, uh, the commands are explained in detail. In this video, I'm going to simply show you how these commands are executed and what the actual output looks like. So this is a machine where I have administrative access in a domain. So this is my lab and training environment. So let's first start Mimikatz. So we need to load the Mimikatz driver. It is already registered and it has started. So let's run process token. Please keep this step in mind. When I was trying DCShadow for the first time couple of weeks back, this was something which took a lot of time. Always use process token. Token elevate will not work in this case because we need the process to be elevated. So this Mimikatz now runs as system, and we need to have two instances of Mimikatz. One must run as system, and it is this uh, instance which will start an RPC server, etc., to get requests. And we need another one which runs with privileges of a domain admin, which we will use to push the attribute values. So let's start another Mimikatz instance. Now this one, the one on the right side on the screen, this one runs as a domain admin, and this one runs as a system. Now let's try our very first attack. Let's change user account control values on a computer object in our current domain. So how will we do that? Let's use the very first command. So this needs to be run from the Mimikatz instance running as system. So what we are doing here, lsadum DCShadow is the name of the module. Let's increase the font size a bit. So lsadum DCShadow is the module name. What is the object? Ops user $19 because it's a computer object. What is the attribute we would like to modify? User account control, and that's the value. So let's run this. An RPC server is waiting for the permissions for the attributes to be pushed. Here, from the instance which is running as domain administrator, we can simply run something like this. We now push the values. Okay, let's try it once again. Okay, this is probably because we do not some things needs to be cleared on the domain controller. So let's see. I believe Okay, let's refresh these servers. Yep, we need to clean this. Okay, now let's try this once again. And if this is successful right now, right. So make sure that if there is an error at the time of registration or unregistration, it is possible that a previously unsuccessful DCShadow had left some artifacts or some permissions modified. So although I wanted to cover this thing at the very last, if you read the blog post, that's the very last thing I've covered there, the problems section. But I'm not going to re-record this video just so that we got a perfect error, which I was actually unable to reproduce while taking screenshots for the problem section. So what we did here, once again, we ran from the Mimikatz instance, which is running as system. We want to modify user account control on ops user 19, and the value of user account control should be 532480. And then we ran the push command from the instance which is running as a domain administrator. And now if we would like to check, okay, so that should be enough. If you would like to check the value for the user account control attribute on the ops user 19 object, that's 532480. So we have modified, excuse me, we have modified the user account control value quite easily without leaving any logs on the domain controller, any logs related to this attribute value change. Now, of course, we can do the exact same thing with the help of Invoke-Mimikatz. So Invoke-Mimikatz, as the name suggests, is a Mimikatz ported into PowerShell. So for that, uh, you can use Invoke-Mimikatz from, let's say, from Nishan, because that's the one I use. It's the latest one. So let's load Invoke-Mimikatz. I hope the Windows Defender is turned off. It is. So here we will make it 8192 so that we are sure that the values are changed. Let's use this. So please keep in mind that because of the output redirection, probably because of that, in PowerShell, we will not see anything like this here, that RPC server is waiting or anything like that. So let's assume that this has been successful. Now what we need is we need to run our PowerShell instance as domain administrator. Let's run this as the domain administrator. So once Invoke-Mimikatz is loaded in the memory of this session, let's push the attributes. So as soon as we push the values, you can see that here the value was set. And if we run the same command now, the attribute has been changed. So those of you who have frequently played with the ACLs or attribute based attacks in Active Directory, this is actually a game changer. Many attributes which could not be modified using, let's say, even etc can be modified with the help of DCShadow, and that too quite silently. So where does it take us? Attacks like uh, setting SID history or primary group ID or modifying permissions of, let's say, admin SD holder, etc., are much more easier, and if not easier, at least much more silent when used with DCShadow. When I started playing with DCShadow, uh, I wondered if it is possible to use DCShadow without having domain admin privileges. Like almost all other domain persistence mechanisms, there are only a subset of all the permissions which DA or DAs have is required to successfully pull off an attack or a persistence technique. So after reading some documentation on MSDN, in fact, a lot more than what I would like. So after reading some documentation, some hit and trial, it was possible for me to zero in on some permissions which are required to use DCShadow without domain admin privileges. So this is the code set DCShadow permissions. This is the code which I used, or I wrote to set permissions for to use DCShadow. So what are the permissions required? Create child and delete child on all the children of cn equal to sites object in the configuration container. Why? Because it is that place. So all your sites reside or are subkeys or objects of the sites container or sites object. So having create child and delete child permissions on this object and all the child objects allows us to register a domain controller. So that's the permission we need here. Then we need three special rights on the domain object. And what is a domain object? If you open up the Active Directory users and computers, that's the domain object. This stuff is the domain object, and we need to add our permissions here. In fact, you can see that there were some permissions here for our current user, right? Let's remove these. What are the permissions? Three permissions. Once again, are detailed in the blog. Install replica, replication managed topology, and replication synchronized. Only these three permissions on the domain object. Write permission on the machine object, which machine object for that machine, which will be registered as DC. For example, in our case, 12.2, which is ops user 12 in the lab. And then write permissions, write property permissions, not write permissions, write property permissions on this, and write property permission on the target object, whether it is a computer object or a user object. Only these permissions are required. If these permissions are set, we can actually use DCShadow without domain admin attributes. So let's have a quick look at that as well. So this was us running as system, and this is the domain admin. Let's minimize these windows. And this was the Mimikatz instance running as a domain admin. Now it's system, so please keep that thing in mind. Because we ran process token here, all the running command prompts, PowerShell, and Mimikatz instances are elevated to system. So this was the one actually which we were running as the domain admin. So let's close this now. And we are going to simply start another session of Mimikatz with the privileges of our current user. who is the user lab user. Now from this PowerShell instance, which is running as DA, we can set permissions for using DCShadow. So let's once again use modify the same object. What we are going to do now, we are going to set permissions. Let me copy that command and then I'll explain that. So what this command does, it sets some permissions. We tell our script that ops user 12 is the machine which is going to be used as a fake DC, that is, it is going to be registered as a DC. Then the target object, which could be a name or a SAM account name or an ADS path. So we are going to modify the ops user 19 object, and lab user is the username, that's our current user, which should have permissions on all the required objects and containers. So let's run this. So permissions have been set for cn equal to sites configuration offensiveps.com. Minimal replication rights, the one which we discussed on offensive PS, on ops user 12 and ops user 19. Now, if we go back to this one and let's run this. So right now, what are these were account control values 8192. We want it to set to 532480. And now if we run the push command from this Mimikatz instance, which is running as a normal user, our push was still successful, and if we load the values here, they have been modified. Excuse me. What does this mean? This means that we can now run DCShadow by modifying permissions for a limited number of objects, and without having to maintain DA access, we can still run DCShadow, which actually personally for me is very, very useful. It may or may not be possible for any attacker or adversary or red teamer to maintain domain admin privileges, but maintaining this level of privilege may be a bit more easier. Okay, so once we are done with that, now let's see what are the actual impact of having the ability of modifying attributes on different objects. Let's set permissions for a current user on another user called helpdesk user. So, and please keep this in mind that right now, just for the sake of demonstration, I have a domain administrator window open here, but in case of a real attack, we must think of an object which we would like to modify 2 weeks or 2 months later on if we talk about persistence, right? We would not have a DA window open all the time for us. Otherwise, there is no use of adding these permissions. So let's run this. Okay, that's an error actually. Let me remove the previous ones first. And that's SAM account name, right? So we have provided our current user permissions over, once again, the domain object, the sites container, this user object, and this computer object, and this helpdesk user object. Now we can simply do something like this. Please keep in mind that we specify the object attributes and values always from that Mimikatz session which is running as system, and not from the one which is running as a current user or as a DA. So we want to modify helpdesk user's SID history attribute and want to set it to the 519 SID, that is the enterprise administrators group. So let's run this. And from the other Mimikatz session, Let's push the values. The values are pushed. What does that mean? That means now help desk help desk users SID history must be set to 519. That is the domain SID-519. Now, in place of checking if it was actually modified there, let's actually try to do some privileged stuff. So let's open up a PowerShell session, excuse me, as help desk user. Now let's try to do the popular DC sync attack. Now, if I run DC sync, because help desk user is not an enterprise admin or a domain admin, this attack should not be successful. But here we can do that. Why? Because our SID history for this current user is set to the enterprise admin's group. That is how DCShadow is actually very useful. Right, so let's kill this session. Now, what else is one thing which we can see here is this actually. Enterprise admins. So you can see that here that help desk user is not listed as enterprise admins. That is, there is no group membership for help desk user, but it still has those elevated privileges. That's the beauty of having the ability to modify the attributes. Now there's one another very useful attribute called primary group ID. Let's change that for the help desk user. Let's first set this one to 513, which is domain users group. And now we modify the primary group ID. We still have the permissions to modify a help desk user. Now we can use the exact same attack once again, but there is a catch with this. You can now see that because we have changed the primary group ID, excuse me, help desk user is listed as an enterprise admin now, because the net command uses primary group ID to look for the group membership. And this is the catch while enumerating a domain. For example, if we run the membership, let me show you that with an example. If I use PowerView, the popular enumeration tool from PowerSploit toolkit, if I use PowerView right now and use its getnet group member enterprise admins, you will not see help desk user here. Why? Because each tool has its own way of listing group memberships. So using primary group ID may or may not be useful for you depending totally on your target environment. So, okay, so this was using primary group ID. Now the next one is what if we would like to modify ACLs using DCShadow? ACLs are governed by the anti-security descriptor attribute. So how can we modify ACLs, and how can we avoid disrupting the existing ACLs? That we can do this way. So we are going to modify admin SD holder. Admin SD holder is a special container which uh, is used, or which is supposed to protect ACLs of these high privilege groups and users. So by default, in a domain, every 60 minutes, a process called stprop runs, which overrides any ACL of a high privilege group by the ACL of the admin ST holder container. So if we can modify the ACL of the admin ST holder itself, our privileges or that modified ACL will be copied to all the privileged groups and users. So let's see what the admin ST holders SDDL or ACL looks like. It's this. Now, to get full control over it, we can use any one of these ACLs or permissions. Allow permissions for system, allow different permissions for the built-in administrator, for the domain administrator, or for the enterprise admins. Excuse me. So we just need to copy this, and in place of sy here, we need to specify our users, the user which we have control over, the user's state, and we should be good to go. And for example, let's modify the privileges of the admin ST holder container and add this at the very end. 2111 is help desk user in this lab. So let's first check if that those permissions are already there in admin ST holder. If they are there, we'll clear them. So no special additional permissions here as of now. So let's once again, what I have done here is copied the permissions for built-in administrator or domain admin or EA group, and in place of built-in administrators, the users SID. So let's copy all this stuff. And we need to add. So now either we need to add permissions for the admin ST holder group for our current user, or we can do this as a DA. So let's add the permissions. So here we will use the ADS path parameter for this particular object. Okay. Okay. Let me have a look at this. Okay, I actually need to use LDAP here. My bad, because it's ADS path, right? LDAP, and this should be good now. So once we have set those permissions, we can copy this complete stuff, which is the modified ACL of the admin ST holder group. Let's start the RPC server, and let's push this. And now let's go and excuse me, and check the permissions of the admin ST holder container. So you can see that the help desk user has all the privileges or full control over the admin ST holder group, admin ST holder container, which eventually should be copied to all the domain admin, enterprise admins group, etc. Right. So the next stuff is, which I actually did just for fun, could be useful in many scenarios actually, excuse me, that is what I call Shadowception. That is using setting DCShadow permissions with DCShadow, right? So sounds fun actually, and that's the reason I could not actually. Of course, uh, that's done just for fun, but I can think of some interesting scenarios for usage of this. So once again, how are we going to proceed with this? We get to list ACLs of the four objects for which we need the permission. For the domain object, for the computer object which we are going to use as a fake DC which gets registered, the target object, and for the sites container. So we list ACLs for all of these, add excuse me, add ACEs for our own user. So 2111 is SID for the help desk user. So please keep this in mind here. We are adding privileges for our current user, that so that we can modify the user later on. So if I copy all of this stuff, do not get intimidated that this huge output, actually not that output, this output comes from this command, right? So let's run all four of these. Please note the stack option here so that we can push multiple uh, requests. So let's start the RPC. We can always run lsa dump DCShadow view stack to see what is on the stack. Uh, and what would be the permissions required to be able to do this? Okay, I forgot to include that in my notepad actually. So we must have modify permissions on the uh, domain object, on this, on help desk user, and scene equal to sites. So okay, I need to pause it once again. Okay, so we need to actually run this as a DA. So we go back here. I mean, we can always use minimal permissions on the domain itself still, but not using this script, set DCShadow permissions. It does not modify the domain object enough, right? So our stack here is waiting with all those permissions. Let's push this. Okay, I think I need to do a cleanup here, probably because of this. Right, so let's remove this and let's try once again. Okay, now we need to clean the SPN of ops user 12 as well, I believe. So let's quickly do that. And if I try it now, okay, it says LDAP count entries is not 1, so a lot more cleanup is required. So clean this. Okay, let's clean this as well. And if I run this now once again without, yeah, so that's done now, I believe. I forgot a command here actually. We need to run lsdump DCShadow to start the RPC server which accepts these values. Now let's run this. So all of the objects, all 4 objects have been pushed. Now what does this mean? This long command means that now if we log in with help desk user, we can perform a DCShadow against itself. And what we can do, once again, we can modify, we can do all of the stuff which we saw here. Stuff like setting SID history, or setting primary group ID, or adding it to the admin SD holder, or whatever. We can uh, do all of the stuff, right? So this is DCShadow with DCShadow, a bit more complex, but do not, once again, do not get intimidated with these big commands, and also not by the couple of errors which we saw. That's good that we saw those errors, right? I did not arrive to having these commands ready without those errors, right? That's how we learn. Lastly, something which I have been working on a lot. Okay, before that, we can always, I'm not going to show a demonstration of this. The video is already like more than half an hour long. So we can of course, always push SPNs. So this is post-Kerber roasting, right? We push SPN on, let's say temp DA is a temporary DA, that is, it is a domain admin, a high privileged user. We force push a SPN. Once the SPN is set, we retrieve the TGS, dump it to the disk, and brute force it offline. So that was the next thing. Once again, listed in the blog post as well. Now, the last thing which I have been working on for past couple of months is Active Directory deception. While working in while doing some red team operations, I encountered some industry products, enterprise deception products. Although many of the products are really good, I found out that the techniques used by some of the tools is very easy to deploy. So first of all, I'm not ripping off stuff from any enterprise product. I just saw enterprise deception products and got interested into this stuff. So I came to understand that it is really possible to modify some attributes of an AD object to fool any adversary, or specifically the tools used by adversaries, right? Being a red team tool author myself, I've found out that me and many fellow red teamers, we specifically look for some special attributes in an Active Directory object to check if it is, let's say, a vulnerable one or an interesting one. One thing which so I've been working on, as I said, for past couple of months on and off. One thing which was always bothering me was the inability to forge a proper domain controller object, right? I could not find a way to edit a member computer object so that it looks like a DC convincingly. Thanks to DCShadow, we can do some interesting stuff. For example, if I run these commands using DCShadow, so here 516 is the domain controllers group. So we change the primary group ID. Then 532480, that's once again associated, the user account control value associated with domain controllers. So let's push that as well. And finally, DCShadow module has an option called manual register. So if you, which is recommended, if you go through the presentation by Benjamin and Vincent, the slides and the videos, uh, you will learn a lot of things. For example, what is exactly a DC? A DC is something which has a couple of attributes listed in the site's container and has some SPNs and services. So in place of setting that manually, I have not checked if all of them can be set manually. I'm not as much smart as Vincent and Benjamin, of course. So we can use something like this. If we use the manual register option, the DC is registered but not immediately unregistered. What does that mean? That means if I run a command like this, and I'm going to paste even this one, that is, if an adversary wants to get the list or a list of the domain controllers in my lab, you can see that the domain controllers group now has the current machine as well. That is an additional domain controller, right? Not only that, if we use the directory services Active Directory.NET class, which is used by many tools like, for example, PowerView. I use PowerView all the time, and that uses this exactly this class. So if we list the current domain, the domain controllers are, this is the correct one and this is the forged one, right? Not only that, even WMI classes, let's say Win32 anti-domain, even if we use that, Win32 anti-domain, so even that lists our box as a domain controller. But you may like to keep one thing in mind. You can see that all the attributes of this forged or fake domain controller are missing. Of course, we can set them. In fact, even in this case, if we list get current domain dot domain controllers, we will see that many attributes would be missing there. But it still is a remarkable improvement, right? We can actually modify, or we can actually register a fake domain controller, which even an adversary may see. So this is very useful. Once you start looking at your Active Directory objects as a mode of deception, you can really improve the defense in your organization. Please keep in mind that this is still at a very nascent stage, very experimental. Do not use these in your production at all. For example, and this I have written in my blog post as well, I'm not sure right now that if you leave a fake domain controller, uh, there is no guarantee. I have not tested that. I mean, in my lab, I have not faced an issue right now, but there is no guarantee that none of your machines will send requests to this fake domain controller and will eventually fail the authentication, right? So still very nascent, but looks very promising, and I'm working on it and really liking it. And this is one of the reasons actually I started to look at DCShadow, the ability to modify those attributes which may or may not be modified otherwise, right? So that would be all for this video. Hope you liked the video and hope you liked the blog post. Thank you very much for watching.